TV was gracious enough to come here and tape the program for us so that others who couldn't make it can also benefit from the presentation. So again, welcome everybody. My name is Shannon. I'm on the Grafton Land Trust Board, and I'd like to welcome you to our presentation today on invasive plants with a little bit of information also on spotted lanternfly. Many of you are members already, but for those who are not, the Grafton Land Trust is a local private nonprofit. It's a member-supported organization, and our mission is to preserve, maintain, and advocate for open space in Grafton. If you're interested in learning more about what we do, or possibly joining as a member, we have some information at the table in the back, or you could join our Facebook or Instagram pages to follow us. And any donations that you make to our organization help us to run free programs for kids, for the community, get people out in nature, and it helps us to acquire and maintain land and trails. So part of our mission is to provide education on topics related to nature and conservation. Invasive plants is the perfect thing for us to talk about right now. I've been out exploring some land trust properties that I'm not as familiar with, and as I go and see the trails, I'm encountering so many invasives on not just land trust, but other, even my own property. I've been battling bittersweet for years. So we thought it would be great to offer this education, just to have the tools to identify and manage invasive plants. So we're also going to learn a bit about spotted lanternfly, which I'm excited about because I don't myself know much about it. So I'd like to introduce Jennifer Foreman-Orrick. Jennifer is an environmental biologist with Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources. We'll probably be referring to that as MDAR. Her current position has her working closely with the State Reclamation and Mosquito Control Board on issues related to mosquito management and the spread of mosquito-borne illness in the state. Prior to this, she served as the state's plant pest survey coordinator at MDAR, surveying for high-priority invasive pests, weeds, and plant diseases, and also doing outreach to the weed industry, gardeners, environmental groups, etc. While at that position, a significant percentage of her time was devoted to Asian longhorn beetle and emerald ash borer outreach and education. She now supervises the staff that performs invasive pest outreach services for her division. So please welcome Jennifer Foreman-Orrick.
Thanks, everybody. All right, so just one more sound check. You're hearing me okay in the back? All right, we've got a lot to cover today, so I'm just going to jump right in. We're going to be covering invasive plants and then a little bit about an invasive bug that we have here in Grafton now. Just wanted to start out with a quick definition. When I talk about invasive plants, I'm talking about non-native plant species that spread into native or minimally managed areas, and specifically ones that are impacting Massachusetts. When I talk about invasive plants, I'm also talking about non-native plants that cause economic or ecological harm by developing self-sustaining populations and becoming dominant or disruptive in those ecosystems or habitats. So I'm not talking about, dandelions in your lawn. That's a very managed habitat. I'm not talking about the poison ivy that's taking over part of your backyard, because that is a weed, but it's a native species. So what exactly makes a plant invasive? This is pretty much the holy grail of invasive species biology. Like, we knew exactly what would cause a plant to be invasive when it was introduced here. Then we could just make a list of those characters and we would go through all the species and say, well, we don't want this one, we don't want this one, this one's okay. But the reality is that we haven't quite figured it out. But we do know that there's certain characteristics that tend to be positively correlated to becoming a successful invasive species. And again, I'm going to be talking about plants here versus animals. But the first thing is just high fruit or seed production. And the best example that I always think of with this is bittersweet. So on the left, we have a picture of the American bittersweet, Celestra scandens, and on the right we have a picture of the Asiatic bittersweet that you all know and ate probably. Celestra originatus. I don't even have a live picture of American bittersweet because I've never seen it. It's fairly rare in the state, but it only flowers and then fruits at the end of the stem, whereas Asiatic bittersweet will put out flowers and then fruits all along the stem axis. So it has like hundreds and thousands of times more fruit output than the American species. In places where the two species coexist, then you kind of get this, what we call it a swapping out. So they're the same genus with different species and they can hybridize, but what happens is that the Asiatic species dominates things because there's just so much more of it around. Another thing correlated with invasive species success is the ability to reproduce vegetatively. So even if you don't have high seed or fruit output, if you can do something like Japanese knotweed can do, which is create an entire new plant from a piece of its just cut stem, then you can be a very successful invader. Another positively correlated characteristic with species invasion is the ability to just have a longer growing season. So there are a lot of invasive species that are the first to leaf out at the beginning of the season. This is particularly true for woody species, and they keep their leaves longer at the end of the growing season. So right now, well, a few weeks ago, the first things to leaf out in my yard are the multiflora rose, like the picture on the left, and the shrub honeysuckle. They're pretty much about to bloom right now. In the picture on the left, everything in the background is brown, except you can see a few green spots, and that's just normal multiflora rose. So you've got a longer growing season, you've got longer photosynthesizers to native competitors, and that gives you like a growth boost. And then if you look out into the woods, or if you look at sort of what I call like edge habitat, like you're driving along a road and there's a bit of sidewalk and then some like scrub and then forest, right? You'll see something like glossy foxthorn often growing along the edge. It also grows along river ecosystems. But as soon as frost hits, most of our native species tend to bring all their resources back down, so their leaves get a chemical signal to fall off and senesce. But glossy buckthorn is still green well into, I think this was from December of 2021. And this plant is still green, still photosynthesizing, still bringing resources into the plant to help it grow bigger next year. Norway maple is another species that you'll see stay green much longer into the fall versus the native maples. Another thing that invasive plants do is that they sometimes alter the environment in ways that give them the advantage. Things like Japanese barberry and also glossy buckthorn exhibit what we call allelopathy, so they'll exude a chemical from their roots that is toxic to any plant that isn't barberry. A good native example of allelopathy is black walnut. If you've ever heard of don't plant anything under black walnut because it will die, that's why. There's also things like autumn olive, which has a association between its root system and what we call mycorrhizal fungus in the soil that allows it to generate nitrogen, which gives it a boost of like fertilizer for itself. But native species have not evolved to take advantage of increased nitrogen composition in the soil, so that's a competitive advantage for the autumn olive. Some of the other things we know that give these invasive species a boost are things like pollution tolerance and shade tolerance. It's something that can grow in full sun, but also in shade as well. Things that can grow in both dry and moist soil conditions. And in a lot of cases, these are the kind of things that people look for when they want to plant something in their yard that they're hoping is going to be multi-pigment. Another thing that we hear a lot about is this, it's called the enemy release hypothesis, the idea that when a plant is imported from one country to another, that it tends to leave behind all of the insects that feed on it and the fungi and things like that that attack it, that make it like super strong versus native species. This on its own is not enough to guarantee something's invasive, but it can take a while for herbivores in the new area to find the plant. So that can be used as well. So what do we do about these ecological threats? In Massachusetts, there's a group that first started meeting in the late 1990s called the Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group, that I'm going to call MIPAC, it's a big mouthful. It's made up of representatives from the government, conservation groups, academia, the nursery industry, lead scientists, horticultural and agricultural folks. They worked with a botanist to come up with this risk assessment procedure to evaluate non-native plant species for invasiveness. If you want to take a look at exactly what's involved in that, you can go to their website, you can scan that QR code. I will make sure that the Graphical Land Trust gets a list of all the links that I'm going to put in the presentation that you can send out to maybe the people that register to upload your members if you want. But basically, MIPAC compiled this list of non-native plant species that were thought to be invasive, mostly based on like expert opinion of invasive species biologists. They run each species through the risk assessment using over a dozen criteria, including the biology of the plant. Does it have a lot of fruit output, or does it spread vegetatively? What's its current distribution in Massachusetts? Is it invasive nearby, or is there a record of it being invasive someplace in the United States? And then it gets all these points, and then depending on the more points it has, the more likely it's going to be categorized as invasive. They also have these like subcategories of likely invasive or potentially invasive, but it's not here yet. Once they do all of the research, the MIPAC group comes together and the members vote. So that might seem a little weird because they're doing this scientific study and it should just be accepted as science, but it tends to be a little more complicated than that, and it's been important to have the nursery industry have this role on MIPAC to be able to vote and say, well, this doesn't make sense, or we don't have enough evidence, we should take a look at that. So they come together and vote, and if they do vote that it's invasive or potentially or likely invasive, then they submit that list to my agency, NDAR, which created a prohibited plant list back in 2005 that was made up of all those species that MIPAC had said were invasive from that initial first run, which is a lot of the stuff you know, like Asiatic bittersweet and purple and stuff like that. And also everything on the USDA federal noxious weed list, most of which has never been seen in the United States except for one species that I'm going to talk to you about later. It's about 140 species total. In 2006, we began prohibiting the import, sale, or propagation of all of these species. MIPAC continues to evaluate new species, and every year or so they request that NDAR amend the list, and we have like a public comment period where people can weigh in. I used to print out the list in Brand, but it changes it a lot, and it doesn't really make sense. It's like 6 pages, so you can just go to mass.gov in that big window that pops up, and you just type in prohibited plant list, or again, you can see on the QR code that there's that super long link there. A few things that have recently happened with the prohibited plant list is that we added Bradford calorie pear, Pyrus caloriana, to the list in September of 2024. We do allow a phase-out period, so any nurseries that had existing stock on hand, they get 3 years to phase it out. We do have also an exemption for, because sometimes calorie pear is used as a grafted rootstock for fruiting pear trees, and we didn't want to make it so that farmers couldn't grow pears to sell, but we just have this rule that if the graft fails, that they have to take the plant out, because sometimes if the graft fails, then the calorie pear just kind of takes over, and we didn't want that. Also, we recently had black alder, jet pea, and this campus sinensis all added to the MIPAC list. These 3 have not been presented to my agency yet. That's probably going to happen sometime this year, and we'll have a public comment period so people can hear. All right, so let's focus on grafting for a little bit. These are the most, first of all, I'm going to talk to you about the most common invasive plants in Grafton, and this is just semi-scientific using the site iNaturalist.org. Have any of you used iNaturalist before? It's basically a place where you can submit records of any plant or animal or anything that you see outdoors, and it will keep a record of the location information, and it will also help you identify it, and there's a community of folks that verify the observations that they are what they say they are. So this is just a map showing you all the data I have for Grafton. It's not a heck of a lot of data. It was only 105 invasive species. There's plenty of other observations in Grafton. I think a lot of them are birds. But I just wanted to show you this and then ask you, what do you think is going to be like in the top 10 for Grafton? I'm assuming mostly for Grafton. Asiatic bittersweet, yeah, definitely. Garlic mustard. Should be getting into this one right now, so I will talk about that. So those are, sorry? Yeah, I don't know if you asked me for this, I'll have to hear. It didn't, but I mean, there were some observations in there. So this is just the top 10 just for Grafton. I think, like, some of these, the number of observations are so low, I'm not sure I would say that this is absolutely the worst species in Grafton, but we have things like Asiatic bittersweet, blue stripe, garlic mustard, barberry, multiflorals, things like that. But I did, just so you can kind of get a better idea, if you look at like all of Worcester County on a naturalist, it's a lot of the same species, but you get things like burning bush or winged enormous, and the buckthorns, and knotweed is obviously up there. So now I'm going to talk about not all of these species, but a few of them in bigger detail, and then at the end I'll kind of talk about like general best management practices for dealing with invasive species, because you'll kind of start to see a pattern depending on the growth form and habit of the plant in terms of management. This is Asiatic bittersweet. I think this is in Needham, Massachusetts, and it's doing what it does best, which is growing all the way up into the tallest pine trees and making a mess of things. Like its common name suggests, this is a species native to Asia. It was introduced to the USA way back in the mid-1800s for its ornamental value. I will talk about that a lot. Back in the mid-1800s, if you were doing ornamental gardening, it was because you were really, really, really rich and you had an estate. And there was like competition between these folks about who could get the weirdest stuff. You know what I mean? So anything that was from Asia was considered super interesting and exotic, so they were constantly sending botanists on exploratory surveys overseas and bringing stuff back. If it makes you feel any better, those same botanists also brought poison ivy to Europe. So Asiatic bittersweet is a woody perennial vine. It has separate male and female plants, and I'll talk about why that's important before I dig into another couple slides. It's bad because it not only, it basically cuts off the ability for the plant to grow in a couple of different ways when it grows around a tree or shrub or something like that. You can find Asiatic bittersweet in pretty much any habitat that's even slightly disturbed. The seeds are primarily spread by birds that are eating the fruit and then putting them out in place. But the roots of Asiatic bittersweet can also suffer, so that means there's an additional local spread. And so this is a tree completely covered with Asiatic bittersweet. You can't really see the tree. And there's a couple of things happening here. This is from Ashland State Park. So if you have leaves that are supposed to be exposed to the sun so that they can photosynthesize and bring resources into you as a tree, and you're completely covered by something like Asiatic bittersweet, then you can't photosynthesize. So that's going to be like a very slow death. But at the same time, Asiatic bittersweet, because it's a vine, has this vining habit. You can kind of see it that's actually several different vines of Asiatic bittersweet lining around the tree and then lining around themselves. And they start out green and flexible, and then they grow and get bigger and woodier, and they start to cut into the plant that they're growing on, so they will cut through, they'll squeeze through the bark into what we call the cambium layer, where all the water and resources are being conducted up and down the tree. So eventually the tree is basically going to be like strangled or suffocated in the bottom. This is what the leaves of Asiatic bittersweet look like. And I just want you to kind of stare at this for a few seconds while I talk. It has egg-shaped or ovate leaves with these wavy margins. And the reason you need to stare at this So if you have a male plant in your yard, it's never going to produce fruit. So you want to learn what the leaves look like so that you can recognize it, and especially so that you can recognize it before it starts to fruit. The flowers of the male and female plants are fairly inconspicuous and they don't last very long. This is how we know Asiatic bittersweet, right? We have these juicy red fruits with the pale orange bracts that serve to make this extra attractive to birds and other animals. This is actually like bird junk food because it's all sugar. So at a time of year when migrating birds need to be consuming lipids and fats to store up for migration, if they're eating this, it's not going to be as healthy because it's just sugars. If you're dealing with Asiatic bittersweet, if possible, manual or mechanical control is the best option, but sometimes it gets out of control. I mean, the stems of this vine can get as big as tree trunks. And in cases like that, you sometimes want to do, sometimes your best option for getting rid of it is just to basically cut it as close to the ground as you can and then paint the cut like stem or trunk with a chemical like triclopyr or glyphosate, just to the base. If you can't cut the stem, then sometimes you can just do what they call nasal bar application of herbicide, where you just coat the trunk of the vine and it kind of will soak in. But first, if you can catch it early, you can certainly pull seedlings and smaller plants just right out of the ground. You don't need any, you just need a good pair of gloves. And we prefer that option, but there's just a lot of places where Asiatic bittersweet is really take it over, and for some folks they just need to do a chemical application because there's no other way to get it out of the environment if they're trying to clear or store an area. And then just some fun facts about Asiatic bittersweet. You're going to see a lot of these for the species I'm talking about. So sale of bittersweet fruits is illegal in Massachusetts because you're not allowed to sell the plant, and it includes decoration. And one time I went to give a talk just like this a really long time ago at I think it was a church facility, and they had these two bittersweet trees, like one on each door to the area that I was giving the presentation. I was like, well, I'm going to take a picture, but and we get calls every year from folks that see like somebody that maybe the reason is like selling it on the side of the road or someplace. And then we also get complaints from people that say that nurseries are selling Asiatic bittersweet, but then it always turns out that they're just selling really, really good plastic flower arrangement type replicas of Asiatic bittersweet. And we've had our inspectors go out and be like, they don't sell bittersweet, they just have plastic bittersweet. You can also make furniture with the really big pieces of the vine. Really weird furniture, but that's okay. All right, next species is multiflora rose or Rosa multiflora. I like the common name, and it identifies this as a wild rose that has multiple flowers for inflorescence, like small flowers in these big clusters. They're typically white, although you will see some that have like a pinkish color to them out in the wild as well. You can recognize multiflora rose in the winter by the tiny little red rose hips that it has. Also, the thorns of Rosa multiflora tend to be what we call the recurve, so rather than sticking straight out, they kind of start to curve back towards the stem. I lost a lot of blood. You find multiflora rose along roadsides and in other disturbed habitats. Again, birds and other animals are spreading the fruit and pollinating new populations to show up. You'll see it. It tends to get into the forest understory, especially if that forest is not pristine, and it can be really difficult to get rid of. It was introduced to the USA again in the mid-1800s, but primarily as rootstock ornamental roses, or as an ornamental, and sometimes planted for erosion control. I mean, again, this is the 1800s, but we didn't really have any basis of engaging ecology. Once multiflora rose leaves out, you can tell it apart from other roses that you might find call these leaflets because this is a single leaf, and at the base of that leaf stem is this feathery bract called a stipule. So on multiflora rose, it's got these little feathery hairs or projections on it, and then compare that to something like swamp rose, which is a native species where I didn't have a great photo this summer, this is the best I could do, but you can see rather than it being like a feathery, hairy stipule, it's just kind of like, looks like two little leaves that are hugging the stem of the leaf. If you're dealing with multiflora rose, one of the ways to manage it if you're not able to eradicate it is just frequently cutting it back or mowing. In my yard, I'm never doing it frequently enough, but if there's an area with it and you could just keep mowing it back every week, that will definitely knock it back over time. You can do chemical application to freshly cut cane, but honestly, I mean, these plants are really like rainbowy and wild, and I don't know if that really makes sense. But also keep in mind that any fruits that have fallen to the ground, the seeds will keep germinating over time. So even if you excavate and pull out the multiflora rose, you have to keep monitoring the area for the next few years in case you see them destroyed. But it doesn't take them long to become out of control from that stage. And a fun fact about multiflora rose is that it is a common wild rose of something called rose rosette disease. Is anybody dealing with this with their garden roses? If you're gardening and you have, like, especially what they call the knockout roses, are very susceptible to rose rosette disease. All the multiflora roses in my garden now having these symptoms where you get these like tiny sort of stressed leaves, you get the reddish coloring, and then it sort of looks like a bonsai version of multiflora rose. So if you're seeing this on wild multiflora rose and you have roses in your yard, you should definitely keep an eye on it because it does spread. Alright, now let's talk about Japanese knotweed. I'm somehow going to get this into like 8 slides, even though I did my thesis on knotweed, so feel free to ask me questions after. If you have more questions after we're done. Right now, probably about in this stage of Japanese knotweed, maybe not on the cave yet as much, but Japanese knotweed is known by a lot of different scientific names. We now call it Olivia japonica, but you might see it referred to as William cuspagatum. And this kind of confounded us when we were first trying to get it out of the nursery industry, because sometimes you see these weird cultivars that have, I don't want to say incorrect labeling, just different labeling than you'd expect. So you kind of have to learn all the different taxonomy. And sometimes the taxonomy differs between what botanists call it and what the nursery industry calls it. But when Japanese knotweed first starts to re-sprout in the spring, you will see it growing several inches a day, and you can look for it in any areas that you saw with the dead trees of the Japanese knotweed in previous years. This was introduced way back in the late 1700s to the U.S., again, as an ornamental and also for animal forage, so like feed grazing, cattle, and things like that, and for erosion control. And you can actually look in really old nursery catalogs from this period in the U.S. and see that they were touting, like, this is a great plant, it grows really fast, it has these beautiful white flowers, it holds the soil. And then you can see these same folks, like, years later saying that we don't recommend that you plant this species anymore because it's really hard to get rid of, which we know. Also, Japanese knotweed has like hollow, noded stems, kind of like bamboo, but it is not at all related to bamboo, which is a grass. And it will reproduce through a number of different ways. I mean, a lot of people used to say that the seeds weren't viable, but the seeds are almost always viable on these plants. Also, that underground root or stem base or rhizome can shoot off like underground stems that can go like several feet away from the parent plant. If you are mowing knotweed and try to control it in an area, it's almost like scattering seeds, because even if it's this big, as long as it's a leaf node, so if it's that part of the knotweed that has a leaf stem growing out of it, it can generate into an entire new plant. And this can especially be a problem if someone's trying to manage it to like keep a right-of-way clear, like you can't see around the road because the knotweed's there, and so someone's going through and mowing it every week, and if there's like a flooded area or a river or stream next to it, then it will flow along and catch on the soil and grow like several feet or yards downstream. You will find it in wet areas, growing on rivers, but also growing around along roadsides. And while it prefers full sun, it will kind of hide out in really shady areas until like a tree falls or a gap appears, and then it just takes off. And here's the helping knotweed just breaking through asphalt. I've seen it growing through concrete. It will, if you have a lot of it on the foundation of your house, it will sometimes find a way inside. It's obviously it's not going to thrive here, but it can cause property damage. Later in the summer, you will see it start to flower, and it produces hundreds of thousands of these tiny little white flowers that quickly go to seed on females. And then you get these sort of, it dies, it's a perennial, but it's herbaceous, so when frost hits, everything above ground will die. Turns this kind of rusty orange, so you can ID it along the roadside now on red, and you can see that those arching stems in the orange color. And the seeds will wing disperse, and that's just some picture of it, so you can see they will. So this is something that's going to do really well on the roadside because the wind caused by vehicles is going to keep the seeds going down the river. A lot of times the above ground growth will kind of collapse over the winter. It's very brittle and it's hollow, but then the new plants will just kind of pop right out. So if you're wondering where Japanese knotweed is going to show up, you can just target an area where you see Japanese knotweed stems that are dead during the winter. It will almost certainly show up again in the spring. This is one that can be really, really tough to get rid of. In really small areas, you can do manual pulling or digging, but you need to dig really deep because that underground stem base can go sometimes in a well-established population several feet down into the soil. So sometimes this is like an excavation project. It's not really with a spade. It really depends. Some folks have had some good success with what we call tarping. If it's possible for you to do this, it kind of depends on where the knotweed is showing up, right? But you can take an opaque tarp and just put it over the area that has knotweed, and then you stake it down but not tight. So the idea means that when spring comes, the soil heats up, the knotweed will start to grow, but it won't be able to photosynthesize because it's trapped under this opaque tarp, so it will start to die. The reason you don't want the tarp to be super tight is that you're going to have these stems that are poking up. And you saw that knotweed can break through asphalt, so you don't want to have like a really tight surface or it's just going to break through the tarp. You want it like loose so that it pokes up but still can't really grow because there's no light. And no matter which one of these things you're doing, this is a multi-year project. You can't just put the tarp on and then next year it's like you just plant like native species. It doesn't work that way. It's going to be a multi-year project. For areas where it's just really out of control and you don't feel like you can eradicate it, you can mow it basically every single week as soon as the growing season starts until the growing season ends. And that over time will start to exhaust the underground resources, but to eradicate it with mowing would be like probably 3 to 4 years depending on the site, and you probably still have to go in and kind of try to dig up the plant, which is why a lot of folks end up defaulting to a chemical application so that they can reclaim the site in a shorter amount of time. You can use the product with either glyphosate or triclopyr, and typically what you would do is cut the stems back in spring or summer and like squirt the chemical into the stems, which really cuts down on any non-target application to the surrounding foliage. And then when it starts to go back again, you can spray that foliage a little bit before frost is going to hit so that when the plant dies back and frost hits, it brings all its resources down into the underground stem base. So if you can blasted those resources with an herbicide, it will take the herbicide down into the rhizome base and kill it off a lot faster. Some fun facts about Japanese knotweed. I don't know if this is fun. There's a giant knotweed that's the same genus but a different species and they hybridize. So actually, a lot of what you're looking at that you're calling Japanese knotweed is really the hybrid. It's called like Bohemian knotweed or Philodendron Japonica. And also, like I said, like, we sometimes see these weird cultivars in the nursery industry that are variegated or have pink flowers. They're not allowed to be sold in Massachusetts, but sometimes they're so different that they just can't see through. Also, they have been saying a biocontrol for Japanese knotweed. It's not a giraffe, although they do feed the giraffes at Franklin Park Zoo in Boston. The knotweed from Franklin Park, they love it, but they don't love it enough to eradicate it from Franklin Park. So there's this little psyllid insect that they've been testing. It does a lot of damage to the stems and leaves of Japanese knotweed, like the picture underneath the psyllid. But so far, it hasn't been able to sustain its own population in Massachusetts, so they're going to be doing some more collections to see if they can get a population of insects that's better matched to our climate. All right, autumn olive is next. Anybody have autumn olive on their property? Somebody planted it on my property before I moved there. I'll tell you why in a few more slides. Autumn olive is something that is seen in the Worcester County area, including in Grafton. It's native to Asia and was introduced back in the mid-1800s to restore degraded landscapes. If you remember a few slides back, I was talking about how autumn olive can fix nitrogen with the association with mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. So these areas that were just like completely degraded and nothing growing on them, they wanted to reclaim the land, and so they would plant things like autumn olive to get nitrogen into the soil, and then they were like, oh, the wildlife can shelter in there, and they can eat the autumn olive berries as food. And this was happening well into the 1990s. Like you could see reclamation recommendations from the USDA would include autumn olive on there. You can recognize autumn olive most of the year when it's not in flower by these leaves that have these very silvery scales on them. So the picture on the left, if you look at the leaves on the right, that's the underside of the leaf. They're like this silvery bluish color. And you can also see sometimes the fruits have these little metallic scales on them as well. The fruits are these like creamy white tubular flowers that typically hang down. As they start to die, they turn sort of a yellowish color. The fruits are very noticeable. They're this juicy red fruit. You can see the little speckles on the fruit, and then the picture on the right is the immature fruit, which is what you'll see most of the season. And again, you can pretty clearly, you can pretty clearly see those silver scales on there, and actually on the stem too. Honestly, if you're dealing with autumn olive, the best thing, it's a shrub, but it's really more like a small tree. It's supposed to have a singular thick stem. So you can use a weed wrench type tool to kind of yank the entire plant out of the soil. You really don't want to do with cutting it back or mowing it. It's really not going to work. You could do a chemical application to the stem, cut at the base, but honestly, just getting it out of the soil is really your best option. And one of the reasons why it still gets attention and sometimes gets planted, I think, is that the fruits are sometimes advocated by folks that do permaculture. So you can eat the fruits, you can make fruit leather or wine out of the fruit. They have more lycopene than tomatoes, and lycopene was named after the genus of tomatoes, like Lycopersicum, which is an antioxidant. So it's good for you, but I wouldn't recommend planting it. But if you have it on your property and site, you could harvest the fruit, and it has so much pectin, it'll just make a nice fruit without anything added to it. All right, let's talk about glossy buckthorn, and I think common buckthorn too. There's a couple slides in here. This is a really pervasive invasive plant on forest edges and along the riparian corridors, so along a forest edge that coincides with riverbanks. This is a woody shrub or small tree that's native to all of Eurasia and also part of Africa as well, in the northern part. It was brought in here again in the 1800s. There were a lot of these tells you part of how it spreads so well. It spreads by seed, but also it suckers. So if you're just trying to get rid of it by cutting at the base of the trunk, and when you leave it, it will just send out a whole bunch of new plants right from that trunk. It can form really, really dense thickets in the forest understory and keep new, bigger trees from growing because of that. The leaves of glossy buckthorn can be recognized by their, again, oval or ovate shape, but has perfectly smooth margins and these really prominent leaf veins. The flowers are these thickly petaled, 5-petaled white flowers. You can even see an ant after pollinated. Something interesting about glossy buckthorn is that it will start flowering and then it will very quickly start fruiting. But the whole time it's fruiting, including once the fruits are mature, it will still be flowering. So in this picture here, you can see there's more flowers here on the same plant, immature fruits and mature fruits. It has a very, very, very long fruiting season, so it has to be pretty intense seed production. If you're looking at glossy buckthorn at a time of year when it is winter, so there's no leaves or fruit variety, this is glossy buckthorn here. It has these very distinct markings on the bark. These are lenticels. They're a way of gas exchange through the trunk of the tree. Compare that to black cherry, also has lenticels, but a different colored, shinier bark. And then common buckthorn, which I'll talk about in a second, doesn't have prominent lenticels at all. And here is common buckthorn, which you also might be dealing with. They have different genera now, but they're very closely related. Glossy buckthorn is Sprangula alnus, used to be Rambus Sprangula, and now common buckthorn Rambus bardica. And again, this is an important feature of both of the buckthorns, that bardica might sound like a good thing, but it's really just a reference to how fast the fruits and seeds will pass through whatever creature eats them. So, and this is sometimes used for its herbal properties as an emetic. I do not recommend that. Anyway, you'll notice that the leaf shape is different, that the veins are more curved, and that the leaves have these wavy margins on them. The flowers of common buckthorn have 4 petals and are green, but the fruits are that same black color. Something that you can do with either one of those buckthorns is kind of a new control option. These are called buckthorn baggies, although I'm not recommending this product. I'm just saying it exists. You can probably do this on your own as well. A lot of folks just buckthorn can be really intense to deal with, so a lot of folks do cut it back and paint the stem with herbicide to get rid of it. But you could do mechanical removal, and also if you have the time and don't mind the way it looks, basically cut the plant down to a few inches above the ground and put this bagging on it and attach it with a cable tie. And any suffering that happens, any new growth that happens, just gets stuck in the bag. And after a few years, you can remove it and the plant doesn't come back. All right, let's talk about garlic mustard. The area can be a lot of. Is garlic mustard flowering here yet? It looks like it's about to open in my yard, but I was in Norfolk County yesterday, and they were about to pop open. So, garlic mustard is a biennial, so it has a 2-year life cycle, and the first year it's just the basal rosettes of leaves, so only leaves growing directly from the ground. And then the second year is what you typically recognize if you're familiar with garlic mustard. It builds up with this flowering stalk, because these flowers at the top, and then it dies. That's the 2-year cycle. And this is how most people recognize it, right? It's 4-petaled white flowers. It's in the mustard family, which has all 4-petaled flowers. Not a lot of plants have 4-petaled flowers. That can be a good way to recognize it, but I'll tell you why you want to recognize it before then if you can. So here's just a really quick look at these sort of heart-shaped, very wavy margin leaves. And of course, it gets its name from the garlic scent to the leaves, although if you're not good at botany, then I wouldn't suggest just randomly touching leaves and smelling them, because you could end up with nettles or something, and that, trust me, does not feel good. This is an invasion species that was brought intentionally to the U.S. way back in the 1800s, is what we call a coated herb, so basically like salad greens, the cheap salad greens you could grow in your garden. I talked about also raised skip to that. I'm going to show you some pictures of the fruit and the seeds in a second. The seeds are very, very tiny and thin, and they tend to cling onto things like animal fur or boots or shoes. And you'll often see populations of garlic mustard that get trailheads, and then it will eventually start to spread through the trail because animals are walking by or people are getting to see them. Here is garlic mustard at its worst. This is a forested area, and garlic mustard is almost the only thing in the forest understory. So basically, this is what happened here. This is a very wet area. The area flooded, and the seeds just spread through this entire understory. And now nothing is here with garlic mustard. And I don't actually want to show the seeds in it on that. But the plants will die, but the seeds will stay on top of these really tall stalks. And if you hit them or you walk by them, you can hear it kind of rattling, and it causes the fruit to sort of open and shatter, and the seeds just go with it. You can also eat the seeds; they're kind of peppery. I don't know if I want to job in harvesting all the seeds. In terms of dealing with garlic mustard, honestly, manual pulling or digging is really the way to go. I don't know if I've ever seen anybody like effectively deal with it with chemicals. But you need to learn when to recognize it. You need to learn to recognize it before it flowers. And I'll talk about why in a second. But also, it has a very long-lived seeding. So if you go through and pull all the garlic mustard from the area, that's your job for the next 5 years too. You can't just pull and say, I'm done. It's going to keep popping up every single year, and if you forget about it for a few years, it'll get just as bad as it was.
It's pretty easy to pull up, isn't it?
It tends to be very easy to pull up as long as the soil's not really compacted. If you wait until it rains, then that makes it even easier to pull up. You can also sort of, if you're able to avoid disturbing the area where there is garlic mustard, then that can help keep the infestation from spreading. But if it's like an area that has deer activity, you're probably just stuck dealing with it. I know the deer are definitely starting around my neighborhood. So the not so fun fact about garlic mustard is that if you pull it out of the ground when it's already flowering, sometimes it will complete its life cycle and go ahead and produce viable seed. So if you can catch it before it starts to flower and pull it out, you can just like leave it and not have to worry about it. But once it is flowering, now that's your job to get that off the site. You can't just pull it completely. You need to bring it somewhere and dispose of it properly.
Okay, that's the key point. Bringing it somewhere. What does one do with the roots, the plants one pulls up, or any kind of invasive? What do you do with that? You can't put in that compost.
Yes, that's a good question. You do not, I don't want to put this stuff in, for the most part, in compost. I suppose in some cases, but if it's garlic mustard that hasn't flowered yet, then you could put it in compost. It's not going to spread garlic mustard. But if you're concerned about, plant parts that could regenerate or seeds or fruits, then there's a few things you can do. Some folks have a separate, some folks keep a separate compost just for the bad stuff. And that's not going to go into your garden. That's maybe just going to stay for several years. And if you have the ability to burn and graft them, then that's another possibility. You could get the proper permits and burn it. You can also do deep burial if that's an option. So if you're able to, you've got a bog cut out the property, you can dig a hole and put it into the waste stream, depending on whether Grafton has rules about that. But if you have a very large site that you're managing, then you would need to get a permit from the Department of Environmental Protection to put the plant material into the waste stream, so the trash stream. I don't know if Grafton, if your trash goes to a dump or an incinerator or something.
Goes to real estate, which is an incinerator.
So you would need, so if there's basically if it's more than 2 bags of stuff, then you're supposed to get a permit. If this really is an issue for anyone, I can provide the contact information to the person that provides the permits. But again, if it's just small amount of material, they're typically not as concerned, but in general, and this isn't about invasive, this is just about DEP trying to keep the biomass out of the waste stream because we have such a limited amount of places to store waste, and burning waste is not great for the environment, so they just, they don't want people like dumping tons of invasive into trash bags and sending them out to the water. All right, next one I'm going to talk about is purple leaf stripe. A gorgeous 6-petaled flower on these really tall stalks. I mean, honestly, this just kind of looks like a wildflower or something to show how pretty these are. But purple leaf stripe is a very aggressive species. You can recognize it again by these purple 6-petaled flowers and these long spikes. It has square stems. You can like feel the edges of the stems. It produces massive amounts of seed. Like one mature plant can produce like 100,000 seeds, and it also can be produced by those underground stems that we call them. This is a wetland species typically, but you will find it in wet areas along roadside, and sometimes just popping it up in other disturbed habitats and places you wouldn't expect it. It was introduced to the U.S. in the early 1800s as an ornamental, but also as bee forage, so for people that were keeping honey. And it has also shown up in ships' ballasts, so the water and soil and other material that they used to use a really long time ago to weigh down ships when they were traveling from one part of the country, like the world. If you're dealing with purple loosestripe, I think the first thing I want to say, and this is true for any of the species I'm talking about today, if it's in a wetland area, if you are in or near a wetland and you want to deal with an invasive species on your property, you have to check with the Conservation Commission, even if it is your property. If you own it, the Conservation Commission has jurisdiction over what you can do on the site. If you're not sure if your property is a wetland resource area or not, then check with your Conservation Commission before you start doing work, because they don't want folks just like tearing up the site and potentially impacting the natural resources of the wetlands. Even though you might feel like you're helping by getting rid of the purple loosestripe, you gotta make sure you're following your rules for this. You can manually pull or dig out purple loosestripe. Sometimes it's not that hard in a really wet area. Any kind of chemical application, again, I have to say that you want to talk to your Conservation Commission first, so that we can talk too much about that. There is a biocontrol that was very successful at eliminating a lot of the purple loosestripe that we have here. It really shrunk down the population. It's a type of beetle with the genus Gallicella. You can actually buy these biocontrols, and they're so widespread now that you can buy them online and get them shipped to you, and it will help cut down on the purple loosestripe you have on your property. But it will only be for like a decent amount of purple loosestripe if you just have 1 or 2 plants. You don't need the biocontrol. You may already have the biocontrol. And basically, if you see purple loosestripe and the leaves have holes in them, it is almost certainly done by this particular beetle. There's actually a few different Gallicella species. All right, so a fun fact about purple loosestripe, there's actually a native congener, so same genus, different species, that's called winged loosestripe that looks very similar to purple loosestripe. It has winged stems, so instead of just being square and pink, I said it's so long looking for any kind of a picture that would really show it. and I'm still not sure it does. So basically, you can see that on the corners of the stem, it kind of projects out into these wings. The other thing you can do, if you have a hand lens, you can count the number of stamens in the flower parts. Purple loosestrife has 12 stamens per flower, and Invasive only has 6. Yeah, that's in the bottom. It also tends to be way less vigorous, fewer flowers per stem. The leaves that are on the flowering stalks tend to be alternate rather than opposite. But so the majority of what you're seeing is purple loosestrife. I'm just saying, if you see something that kind of looks like purple loosestrife that seems not as vigorous, you might double check to see if it's the native species. Okay, so just some general stuff to talk about here. If you're dealing with a species that puts out a dangerous harvest and you want to control this particular invasive, then you need to kind of plan things out so that you're acting before the plant set seed. Things like garlic mustard, or one of the ones we didn't talk about today, the small awards that are like milkweed, they go and disperse seeds in big pods that break open. You're going to want to plan to do management of these species earlier in the season versus some other plants where you might just be able to just get to it later on. So you kind of got to plan out what you don't want to miss the garlic mustard timing. Like right now is when you want to be doing the garlic mustard. That's going to make it the easiest. Like you won't have any real need for disposal if you can get it before. And this again, you know, if you can get the garlic mustard when the snow's on the ground and pull it out, if you get it, learn to recognize it when it just has those basal leaves. And then I think this video, let's see. Alright, I'll send a link to the video. There are a few different companies that sell this device. Sometimes they call it a lead branch, sometimes they call it the uprooter. Anyway, so it just says cannot claim the lead. Anyway, this is basically a mechanical lever that has a big metallic base, and then at the bottom it has a piece that you clamp on to the base of the tree or to the base of a woody shrub. So you could use it for shrub honeysuckle, burning bush, definitely for this was with glossy buckthorn, things like that. And basically that can make it so one small person can just attach it to the tree, and then you clamp down on that big white part and pull it back, and the whole plant just levers right out of the ground. And then it's just out. Obviously this can cause some erosion issues. You gotta be careful if you're doing some large areas, but it is a great chemical-free way at controlling woody cases. California put up this great document a few years ago, and it might seem silly that I'm recommending something from California, but the reason why it's good is because rather than have it be organized as this species you do this species you do this, it's actually organized more like this type of plant, this growth form, this is what you should do if you want to practice non-chemical invasive species weed control on your property. So that's why I share a link to this, and again, I make sure that you guys have links to send out to folks if they want. And now I want to spend a few minutes talking about some plants that I hope you've never seen, but if you do see them, we want you to report them. The first is giant hogweed. This is my coworker Trevor. He's our tallest coworker, I think. Just to give you a sense of how big this plant is when it flowers and how big the leaves are. Hogweed was introduced here, again, a state garden. This weird ornamental plant. It was brought here back in the 1800s. They didn't know any better. It was first found in Massachusetts back in 2002. There was a population that showed up in Boston, and then a few populations that out in the western part of the state, of Berkshire County. This is an herbaceous biennial or short-lived perennial that can reach up to 20 feet in height when it flowers. And what that means is that it's typically 2-year cycle, right? First year, it just grows, again, just like garlic mustard, with those basal leaves. And then the second year, it folds and puts up a flowering stem. And then once that fruits, that signals the plant that it's time to die. But if for some reason it doesn't achieve flowering, like it gets come back too early or something, then it could survive for a few more years until it puts on a flower, and that flower is the hormonal signal to die. The flower, it flowers in summer, and then the seeds persist on these really long flowering stalks that can then tip over and cause soil erosion, especially if the plants are going on rivers. And now that pogweed is here, we have to worry that it's being spread around in soil because the seeds will last in the soil for many, many years, that people are accidentally doing yard waste disposal of leafy seeds that they have on their property, and also any kind of flooding or erosion that's occurring if it's flowing along a river or a stream. This is the one species that I'm talking about that's a federally listed noxious weed, and that is because it has something called phototoxic sap. If you don't like gross pictures, please close your eyes, and I will tell you when it's okay to look, but I just want to show you what it means to get exposed to phototoxic sap. So if you get the sap of giant hogweed on your skin, and like it's dark out, and you can somehow get back to a place and wash it off with really good soap, you might be okay. But if you get, if you're outside and it's sunny, then your skin is going to very quickly be filled with these really nasty, painful, fluid-filled blisters, like this person's forearm. And I'm now off the picture, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. It takes a long time for those wounds to heal, and then for years after, people report that they have excessive sensitivity to the sun, so that skin will burn super fast. We have giant hogweed in a few different places across Massachusetts. This is a map from our online test dashboard. You can scan that QR code if you would like to investigate and click away on the map and see what thousands in. We have a lot of sightings of it in the western part of the state. The green color here is showing where these are active sites that are under eradication, and then we have some gray towns here. And again, if you can't see that color, you can go to the map and that QR code and just click, and it will give you something. It'll give you the information about the year it was found in those counties. But the gray ones are places where we've eradicated it from, and you can see there's a mix of sites here. So in terms of IDing giant hogweed, again, the leaves grow in a rosette around the bottom of the stem, so it looks like they're coming out of the soil. And they can grow up to 5 feet wide. This is a whole leaf here, and you can see that it has several lobes on it, and each of the lobes is very deep. It has these deep cut teeth that then have these sharp pointed teeth on the margin. Once the flowering stem shoots up, you can recognize it by these purple splotches on the stem, and also these silvery long leaf hairs that are scattered across the stem, and these rings of hairs along where the leaf comes out of the stem. Compare that to the related cow parsnip, which is a native species in the same Heraclean genus, where you see the stem is green, not purple, and also it has a much more dense covering of hair. So giant hogweed is in the carrot family. If you're familiar with plants, then you'll recognize giant hogweed. It has these umbelliferous inflorescences, so this sort of looks like an umbrella-shaped flower head with tiny little tiny white flowers on them that depend on the snail, so you understand how big these plants do get. We do get a lot of reports from folks that are worried they have hogweed. Sometimes it's the native cow parsnip, sometimes it's the other name. I did bring a few handouts that you're welcome to take with you to the table over there showing that information. Also, sometimes we get reports that sort of look like giant hogweed, but it's got yellow tiny flowers, and this is typically wild parsnip, which I don't think it looks similar, but I just wanted to mention it because it's also a non-native species, and it also has some of that same phototoxic sap issue. It's not as bad as hogweed, but if you do see something like this growing in an area, you don't want to be out there in shorts and flip-flops or going in a way that you're not protected cause a reaction on your skin. So the goal of hogweed is management towards eradication. It's one of the few species that we're so, I don't know if we care about it, but it's just one of the few species where we caught it early enough and we're so concerned about it that we want to make sure that we get rid of it if we can. So again, we have eradicated some sites. There are some sites where the property owners are taking care of it. With hogweed, we do have, like, some of our inspectors will dig it out if they can. It's got a tap root, so if you can, I would say before the plant starts to roll, you can get to it when the leaves are still close to the ground. You can use a sharp shovel to go slightly on the ground and just sever the plant from the tap root and it will die. But people tend to be very nervous about close encounters with the species because of the staff. So in a lot of cases, they are using chemical control, but if they aren't, then they might be digging it out and or doing the taproot cutting. And when our inspectors do it, they're wearing a full tie-dye suit and goggles so that they don't get the sap in their eyes or on their skin. And you want to try to do this as early in the season as possible because those leaves are going to get 5 feet wide each. If you miss the flowering cycle and you haven't done control, then you could just block the flowering head off. If you're really careful, you can sort of, you can get one, you wait till it's all kind of dry and brown, hold a big landscaper bag and have someone cut it instead of falling. We've done that on some sites where we found it too late in the season. At that point, we've limited how many seeds are dispersed, so that might help keep it under control, but you still need to keep going out to the site. If we go back for 5 years before we consider a site for ground. Really big infestations can be managed by going, but again, only if you're wearing proper protective equipment. You want to clean the machinery off when you're done. But at several of the sites, we actually have hired a contractor to apply a part of the glyphosate to just knock it back because there's this one site on the Western Mass where there's like over an acre of it, which just kind of took over the whole area. Okay, hogweed quiz. Does anybody know what this is? Well, same family. I'm impressed. So this is tall blue lettuce. I mean, to me, this doesn't look anything like hogweed, but if folks come to you with questions, because they know you're into plants or into nature, then I will tell you that people see like any really big tall plant, like tall blue lettuce will get all of the meat, like 7 or 8 feet high with flowers. And to some folks, that's what stayed in their mind, that they saw a really big plant and they're like, oh, hogweed has really tall flowers, maybe that's hogweed. So we get reports of that. And of course, we do get reports from people reporting clean animals. And I think it's just that some folks don't realize that this is how big green anthers is going to get with the flat. The inflorescence doesn't grow over time. All right, next one I want to talk to you about is minute vine. I don't think we have any of it in Grafton that I know of, but it's all around you guys. So I wanted to talk about it. This is an annual vine, so unlike something like bittersweet, where at the end, it'll just keep growing every year. Minute vine dies back when frost hits, and it's not a problem after that. But it produces a lot of seed, and the seed stays in the soil a long time. So if you can't manage it early enough, and it fruits and the fruit's drop, then you've got 5 more years of monitoring for this plant. Minute vine loves disturbed areas. It likes roadsides and disturbed fields, and it can survive in a variety of light and moisture conditions, so it does prefer open areas. This is the one species I talked about that was not introduced on purpose. It was actually brought here as a contaminant in nursery stock. So basically folks that were going overseas to do botanical collections and then bringing it back. And then the minute was in the soil. It was first found in the U.S. in Pennsylvania in the 1930s. And here's a map of every place we know of it now. Now that it's here, it's being spread in contaminated soil. It sometimes gets stuck in vehicles that are at a construction site that has minute vine. The fruits float in water, so it spreads that way. And then wild animals will eat the fruits. This is our pest dashboard map from our limit vine. You can see we have it all over the place. It was first found in what we call fowl meadow, like fowl of the bird, FOWL, which is a part of the Bluefield Reservation in like the Canton, Dedham-ish area in Norfolk County. And then we also found it in Falmouth on the Cape in the Francis Crane Wildlife Management area. And honestly, like the control of myeloid started before I started with MDAR. I think we all had hopes that we had caught it early enough, but I would say at this point we haven't. We have it in too many different parts of the state, too many different towns at this point to get rid of it, but there are, we still don't have folks in managing it now. And here's myeloid line growing on the side of the road. You can see it's kind of climbing up into the shrubs. It's never going to get up at the top of the pine tree like this. And here it is in fall meadow. You can see pretty much everything in the understory here is myeloid vine, and then everything under the myeloid vine is dead myeloid vine. So you get this like weird pushy carpet of all this vegetation that dies back at the end of every year. And yeah, it will grow up into a tree, but it will only grow up as far as it can in one growing season, and then it dies off. So myeloid vine, I have a fact sheet here, has perfectly triangular leaves. That's probably the easiest way to ID it. But if you get closer to the plant, you can see that and feel that it has these small curved barbs along the stem, so it feels like comfortable to hold it. It's not like touching, blackberry where it's really, you don't want to touch it, but it will feel weird and kind of catch on your clothes. And then along the stem, it has these saucer-shaped, like modified leaves that they call ocrea at the stem node. So every place where it's sending out like another branch to grow into, more leaves or more fruit, it's got one of these giant prominent collars on the stem. If it's fruiting, it is incredibly recognizable. It has these metallic blue fruit clusters. A little porcelain, I don't know anything else that has to do with that. We do have a lot of similar species, which is why we put the fact sheet together, but I would say, if the leaves are perfectly triangular and there are barbs along the stem, we would want to report it. We have managed some sites, and we did actually have a biocontrol for a few years that we were able to release in both Fowl Meadow and Francis Crane Wildlife Management area. And we're finding the biocontrol at a lot of sites in parts of the state where we did not introduce it. So it's getting around, it's probably being brought accidentally with the myeloid that also be brought accidentally to different sites. The good thing about myeloid though is that since it's an annual, you can catch it before the fruits are there, you can just pull it out of the ground and leave it there, and it's not going to re-sprout or anything. It's a really easy way of managing it without a herbicide. Once it starts to fruit now, you're trying to pull it and not have it loose. Honestly, that's really the best thing to do is to schedule them out and find management really early. Here's some of the other sites where we introduce the legal program. They're out there, they're just not doing as good of a job as we wanted them to do. We don't really understand why maybe they're just not as successful in this environment as they have been in some of the mid-Atlantic states where the biocontrol is large. All right, last plant I'm going to talk to you about is kudzu. If an invasive plant is really bad in New England, they'll call it the kudzu of the north. But we actually have kudzu in Massachusetts. This is a site, this is a site in Needham, Massachusetts, where we've been controlling kudzu for several years. Kudzu is a legume, so similar to peas and beans. It has those pretty standard, what we call trifoliate leaves. So a leaf with 3 leaflets on it and a triangle shape. This is a semi-woody, rapidly growing perennial vine, so it will come back every year. It reproduces primarily by rhizomes, so that's underground stems, but also runners. So similar to strawberries, it will have a stem that will grow right on top of the soil. And sometimes it's really hard to find if it's in a densely vegetated area. This is a plant that was brought here on purpose as a ground cover. Again, in the 1800s, before we knew better, to combat soil erosion. It is a legume, so it is able to fix nitrogen 1970 in Connecticut, and then was found in the 80s a few years later in Massachusetts. This is our pest dashboard for kudzu. I'm only showing part of the state because these are the only areas so far that we've confirmed it's just in the not. These is actually the furthest west at this point that we found it, or please report it if you've seen it. Some of these were intentional plantings that got out of control, but we've been able to work with the property owners to eradicate it, get rid of it, get it out there, basically. So if you're seeing kudzu, here's what you want to look for. So you've got these 3 little leaves, and each leaf has like a sort of typically mitten shape to it, right? It's got a big lobe and a smaller lobe. And then if you take a look at, this is what we call the leaf stem or pedula, then you'll see that the distance between the leaflet and the leaf stem is long for the top one, but then super short for the side one. You can also, remember stipules from the multiflora rose? You can also look for these paired stipules. Look how tiny they're little pairs for the kudzu stipule. And then the leaf stem, and sometimes just the whole stem, is covered with these like rusty orange long hairs that are visible without a hand cleanse. So they're really, really obvious. When it's flowering, it produces these clusters of purple flowers that, I'm not kidding, it smells like grape soda, like baked grape smell. It's really, really distinct. And once the fruits form, the fruits are, again, they're legumes, so it has like a seed pod that doesn't mean that it's this dry, hairy brown pod. Of course, there's lots of similar species, so I do have a fact sheet for that one on the table as well if you're interested. We have been trying to manage these sites for eradication in Massachusetts. Some of them, I shouldn't say we, some of them have been the state, but some of them have been towns or groups that are managing their own sites. But the National Park Service has been managing kudzu on Boston Harbor Island. The town of Marble has eradicated theirs and created this amazing site with a park with the swings and then a pollinator garden where the kudzu used to be. You really have any idea what's over there. This is another site in Needham. For somehow there are 2 sites in Needham. You could never connect them, but this was somebody that planted kudzu in their garden and then kind of left it and they got old and eventually passed away and it just kind of took over the whole yard and went up into the trees. So we actually went into this site and did a treatment with glyphosate, just like spraying all the leaves to kind of knock it back, which mostly works. This is after 1 year. You can see we missed a few areas here, and also we exposed a really steep slope that we were concerned that there was going to lead to some erosion. So the second year we went back and treated what we missed, but we also planted a grass seed there to hold the soil. And then a couple of years later, you can see, the grass didn't stay really well, but the kudzu was pretty much gone. The hill's still there, which is good. We did find a little baby kudzu runner down in here that we cut and treated with chemical again. And this is 2020, new property owner, nice green lawn, trampoline, no sign of kudzu. And this is a property that's adjacent to DCR Park, so we're really happy that this turned out to be successful eradication. Okay. We've been here a while, and I appreciate your patience. I'm just going to talk over 5 more minutes about spotted lanternfly, because this is the first talk I've given where I've actually been in a town that has lanternfly. And, if you have to go or you're tired and need a break or whatever, at least take a picture of the screen, and I do encourage you to attend our online spotted lanternfly webinar on May 14th. It's a free webinar where we talk about what we've been doing in Massachusetts with this pest. And you might find it interesting since it's a pest really different than crafted in your own way. Okay. So spotted lanternfly is an actual true bug. When I not, were you trying to get a picture and I like,
Can you send us when we go to
yes, I have a little on the side. Thank you. We'd love to have one of those. Okay, so, a lot of people call all insect bugs, but this is actually, we call it a true bug. It's in the order of bugs that we call midterms. You can tell they're bugs because they have these like piercing, sucking mouth parts that allow them to suck the sap from plants. And it definitely does that. Its preferred plant is tree of heaven, which is itself an invasive species. So if all landslide do with bacteria in it, we might not be that concerned about it, but it has a number of other hosts. It likes maple, it likes grape, it likes walnut, it even goes after hops. It goes after little hops. The reason why it's a concern is that when these bugs are piercing the plants and feeding on the sap of the plants, the sap is too watery, and so they're filtering out all the water, and they're taking in nutrients that they need. And that means they're producing a huge amount of waste product, which we call honeydew. Now, if you are ever dealing with aphids, particularly with milkweed and you see aphids on it, or roses in your garden and you see aphids, then you know what honeydew is. It's this sticky, sugary waste product that collects on the leaves and on the ground all around where you live. You know, if your car is parked under a tree where a whole bunch of bugs are feeding, sometimes you'll see on this like looks like rain, but it's stuck to your windshield. That's typically honeydew. Honeydew on its own can be a pain in the butt. You have to clean it, it gets sticky. But as honeydew accumulates, it starts to ferment, and then it starts to grow a fungus that we call sooty mold. It's a gray, powdery fungus. And then the sooty mold will sometimes attract secondary bacterial infections. So here you see a tree that landfly are feeding on, and this is honeydew spilling on the tree, and then it gets all black with that sooty mold fungus. And then this is sooty mold that has a secondary bacterial slime on it, and so it's gross, and sometimes it smells really bad, especially when there's a lot of landslide. This is bad for the plants because the plants, especially when their leaves get covered with sooty mold, the leaves can't photosynthesize, so this is impacting the plants negatively. It can sometimes even impact their ability to deal with really cold temperatures. And the other thing that happens when you have a lot of honeydew production is that you get increased activity of things like wasps, hornets, bees, and ants. So a lot of stinging insects that a lot of folks aren't comfortable with or even might be allergic to and don't want to know. Here's just a close-up of that piercing mouth part or proboscis of spotted landflies, just so you can see. The younger ones tend to stick that into more herbaceous plants, but an adult lanternfly can use that to pierce the bark of the tree through. And here's just an example of what sooty mold looks like. This is on grape leaves. And think about the fact that a lot of our forest understory is filled with wild grapes, and there are a lot of animals, including a lot of insects, that depend on wild grapes as a host plant. So this is going to impact us ecologically. Here's a lanternfly feeding on a tree. I think you can tell it's kind of like shiny because this whole area is just coated with the honeydew and the sooty mold. And here's a European hornet that's just kind of feasting on them. Sometimes you can even find infested areas, lanternfly infested areas, by just following the stinging insects. Like it's that much activity. And then here's an issue that folks are dealing with in really heavily infested areas. We've seen this in other states. So this is somebody's porch steps, and you can see that's what the porch should look like. And then here's the lanternfly honeydew covered porch steps. Sooty mold is also really slippery, so this could even be a safety hazard for folks. It's kind of to make it so that you can't really enjoy being outside at certain times of the year. And that's what we're seeing in some of the other states where we're participating in. So spotted lanternfly is a huge host range, but I did highlight the species you're most likely to find it on. It's funny at this time of year we're seeing them on roses for some reason. We don't really know why. On Asiatic bittersweet sometimes. And sometimes just resting on poison ivy that's on a tree. This is just a quick, I normally go through tree of heaven ivy, but I'm just going to say, like, stare at this, and if you know where there's tree of heaven, then you should be periodically checking out the land fly, because if this species is in the area, that's where the land fly is usually close. Under this video from it just says come off the media. I apologize. This is just to show the land fly speaking on the grave so that you can see the honeydew dripping out of the lanternflies. Yeah, this is probably coming. The lanternflies, before they meet, tend to aggregate by thousands on trees. They'll move on, these are maple trees. We've heard of them moving into apple orchards. They don't seem to damage the tree, but for like 2 or 3 days, they kind of take over and they can be really huge nuisance. And I think this is what okay, here is a map of every place where we have found spotted lanternfly as of this month. This is really frustrating. I used to be able to fit like a nice big version of the map so you can actually see the details, but it doesn't work anymore because it's in so many different states. And basically there's like these little purple dots marking where it was found, but there wasn't an active population. But at this point, pay attention to what's colored in with that blue color. You can see it's very heavily infested in this area right here. You can also use that QR code to go to the interactive version of this map. Okay, this. You want to check it out. And here's a map of where we have it in Massachusetts. These are confirmed, towns with confirmed infestations. This is again from our pest dashboard. You can take a deeper dive into it, go interactive using that QR code. You can see that we have several areas here. It was actually first found in Fitchburg. For whatever reason, that population hasn't really been extinct. But we found it in Shrewsbury next, and you can see that's a huge patch of town. And you can see in that sort of Springfield, Holyoke, Avalon area, it's also active. And then this is the Seekonk area. This is basically spillover from infestation that started in Rhode Island. But we're more concerned about this here, right? So just to zoom in, so we're here in Grafton, and from what we can tell, Route 20 seems to have just been really effective at spreading the lanternfly up and down the state. We don't, from east to west of the state, we don't really understand why, but it's doing, you'll see that it coincides with Route 9 and Route 20, and there's lots of railways going through, and they sometimes spread on the river. But just so you understand what we're dealing with here, the infestation started in Shrewsbury. There's a large amount of it in Shrewsbury, and it has spread into Worcester. But we also find it in Auburn, Woodbury, and we're almost surrounded at this point in Grafton. But so far, I can't show you the exact sites of where we found it, but I will say that it's pretty much isolated to like the very, very northwest part of Grafton. As far as we know from last year's surges. I'm expecting, you're not going to have less lanternfly this year, so I'm expecting it to start to become, in the southern part of the town as well. So I just kind of wanted to keep it. Of course, I have to look up, are we in it right now? We're not. It's north of here. So what you can do to learn, to deal with lanternflies, you want to learn how to recognize it, and then I'm going to give you some tips for dealing with it. And I also brought some copies of our management guide, so if you are seeing it on your property or where you were, probably want to take a copy of the management guide and look at what you're dealing with. This is a typical insect life cycle where the eggs hatch and you get these little nymphs. So this is like not a complete metamorphosis like caterpillar or butterfly. It's like you get these nymphs that kind of look like the adult but don't have wings, and they get bigger and molt and start to look more like the adult, and then in the final stage you get the wings. So for most of their life, that they're able to walk around, they're not fly. Right now, we are still in, the catch hasn't happened yet, but it's probably going to happen over the next few weeks. So it's good to recognize what the egg masses look like. And I actually brought a specimen on the way out, pass by, and take a look at the little black micronaut box so that you can see what an actual egg mass looks like. So they're about half an inch long, and then each egg mass contains about 30 to 50 eggs. The female lays the eggs in these like rows, and if you scrape away the egg mass, you can actually see it almost looks like a little tire track of where the eggs were. And typically the female will cover over the egg mass with this putty-like protective coating, but sometimes she only does like half of it, or sometimes it's completely exposed, so you still can recognize all of those things. And in terms of where these are being found, obviously on Tree of Heaven, you're going to see a lot of them, and this is just like getting closer from left to right, so there's a lot of egg masses on a tree. Here they are close up, fresh egg masses. This is one egg mass really, really close up, and you can see that like, as it ages over the winter, you start to see these like cracks and fissures in the egg mass, so it sort of looks like dry mud that's cracking. And you will find these egg masses not just on trees, but on pretty much everywhere. Because when the female's ready to lay, she will just lay that egg mass. So on wood, like on a park bench or on a porch, on rocks, for some reason, on like rusty metal sometimes, so tires, if they're in an area with vehicles, wheel wells, camping gear, just outdoor furniture, they can be everywhere. And just a quick look-alike sort of brain check here. This is a lanternfly egg mass. This bigger, fuzzier orange one is the spongy moth, also an invasive species, but a different look to it. Also, if you get really close, you can see these little pinprick holes on the spongy moth egg mass. That is a biocontrol at work there. Sometimes we get people reporting praying in as egg cases as lanternfly, and a lot of times fungal growth on a tree will look from far away like lanternfly. If you're not sure, you always need to spot or report with us to check in. Once the nymphs hatch, when they first hatch, they're white, and then they very quickly turn into these little tiny black creatures with tiny like polka dots on them. They're very tiny, they're sort of like tick size. And over time they start to grow bigger, but they stay black in the spots. And then the last nymph stage before the adult, they molt and there's something red with black and white markings. This will be later in summer. And then here are the adults. They're about an inch long and they have these gray wings with black polka dots on them. And then underneath they have a second set of wings that is bright red with black top. This might seem like, I don't know, I think when people look at this, oh my God, I'm totally going to move if I see a lanternfly. But they do, somehow this is camouflage on a tree. Like it can be harder to see them because they kind of blend into the dark, especially after you're looking. So that is, sorry, that hour was late. All right, so what are we doing at the state level to manage spotted lanternfly? We have folks that are out there monitoring, using traps, and also surveying with binoculars to look for spotted lanternfly. Right now, they're still out there. If they find egg masses and they can reach them, they're scraping them off the tree and just disposing of them so that we can limit the spread of the infestation as much as we can. In really heavily infested areas, we even have these backpack vacuums that they're using to just suck up the nymphs. It was an idea we got from New York because New York's been dealing with lanternfly infestation on cruise ships. They can't really go in and start spraying a pesticide on cruise ships, so they just started using vacuums. It's a really great chemical-free option for dealing with large lanternfly infestation. They have been there some treatments though. So what you can do is, so you've already learned how to ID spotted lanternfly. Here's just some basic tips for dealing with this pest. If you know you're in an infested area or you're traveling to an infested area, keep the windows closed in your car and check your car before you leave so you're not taking hitchhikers with you at times of year when you know the nymphs of the adults are around. If you're leaving an area that's infested, please check your vehicle. They love to hide in what they call wiper wells, so like the area where your windshield wiper is attached to the hood of your car. And they've done studies where if they found that if you drive on a highway like that and they're in the wiper wells, they can actually just totally survive and still be on your car and get to your destination. If you do find lanternfly egg masses, please scrape them off and squish the eggs. And again, if you are in an area with limits, so you take our management guide, because you kind of need to decide what the threshold is on your property for dealing with it. You might be just fine with it, or you might decide that you need to do some kind of a treatment because you have been living out on your back porch for so long. It's going to be up to individuals to figure out, what the best management practice is out for them on their property. We have all kinds of, we have an ID poster and all kinds of tips, like checklists of things to check for landslide. And like if you have folks driving in and out of infested area as part of their job, we have a driver's guide that we can keep with them. And just a couple of last things, like, we don't get a lot of opportunities for this, but in general, it's easier to deal with invasive species before it really takes hold. So something like kudzu or hogweed, we can actively try to eradicate it versus something that's been, for hundreds of years and is really widespread. Like that is not where we're at the point where people have to just kind of deal with it on their own property and the state really doesn't have the resources to help. I mean, it's a lot easier and cheaper if you deal with something that you know is bad that's on your property and there's just one or two of it versus several years later where it's going to be difficult to possibly get rid of it. If you do see something that isn't one of these common species and you're not sure what it is and you're worried about invasive, whether it's a plant or an insect, you can always go to our website, massnrc.org/pests, with an S at the end, and send us pictures and file a report, and we can typically ID things pretty quickly if you get their photo. And I just wanted to give you my contact information. I know I went through a lot of information really fast. If you have more questions and we don't have time to take them, but I know I'm going to be a bit late, you can always shoot me an email. You're also welcome to sign up for our monthly pest newsletter, which is just 4 bullet points a month about what's going on with invasive species in our state. I don't know if we've got time to go these newsletters these days, so we keep it really short on purpose. And that's it. Thank you very much for sticking it out with me.
Thank you very much to Jennifer. That was a really informative presentation. In terms of the land trust, if you see invasive species on land trust property and you'd like to report it, you're welcome to contact us. We do have monitoring going on throughout the year, so if you're interested in being a property monitor, please let us know. I know Chris is one of them. I do property monitoring, so does Joanne. We're always looking for more volunteers. And we probably will have a volunteer invasive species cleanup day on one of our properties. We just have to kind of pick because, as you can see, there's lots of options. We've got burning bush, we've got honeysuckle, bittersweet, so many different